Hi there, welcome to Jayville Stories. Please subscribe to my channel and turn on the post notifications to get updated when interesting stories are uploaded. Thank you. In the vibrant suburb of Westlands, Nairobi, the Makori family was known for its strong bond and sense of discipline, especially under the leadership of the late Mr. Peter Makori. However, beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect household lay a subtle yet persistent tension between his two daughters, Grace and Linda. Grace, the older of the two, was the golden child in every sense of the word. From an early age, she had displayed a natural aptitude for academics and a quiet, disciplined demeanor that endeared her to everyone around her. Teachers at her school would often comment on her intelligence, neighbors praised her for her good manners, and her father, Peter, showered her with admiration. Peter's eyes sparkled with pride whenever Grace came home with another academic certificate or award, often referring to her as my pride and joy. Linda, on the other hand, was cut from a different cloth. Spirited, adventurous, and headstrong, she struggled to live up to the high expectations set by her elder sister. Her report cards often came home with red marks, and she was known for her impulsive behavior, which led her into trouble more times than anyone could count. While her father often encouraged her to try harder, her mother, Martha, wasn't as forgiving. "You need to learn from Grace," Martha would often chide, her tone sharp with disappointment. "Why can't you be more like her?" For Linda, the comparisons were relentless and the message was clear. Grace was the standard and she was the failure. Despite her best efforts to win her mother's approval, her attempts were often dismissed or overshadowed by Grace's achievements. The sisters' dynamic only became more strained after Peter's untimely death in a car accident. His loss left a void in the family that Martha tried to fill by taking on a stricter role. Her grief seemed to amplify her favoritism toward Grace, and her criticism of Linda became harsher. Martha's words, though perhaps unintentional, were daggers to Linda's fragile self-esteem. One fateful evening, the family attended a community event at the Westlands Recreational Hall. Grace had just been recognized for her outstanding performance in a regional debate competition, and the room buzzed with congratulatory remarks. As Grace beamed with pride, Linda sat silently in the corner, her hands clenched into fists. A relative approached Martha, smiling broadly. "You must be so proud of Grace," she said. "She's truly a reflection of her father." The remark, innocent as it was, felt like a slap to Linda's face. She excused herself from the table and stepped outside into the cool Nairobi evening. The twinkling city lights in the distance did little to soothe her growing anger. For years, she had tried to be seen, to be noticed, yet it seemed her efforts were always met with indifference or outright criticism. Later that night, as the family returned home, Linda couldn't hold back her frustration any longer. In their shared bedroom, she confronted Grace. "Do you even realize how lucky you are? Everyone worships the ground you walk on," she spat, her voice trembling with emotion. Grace, startled, looked up from her book. "Linda, what's wrong? Why are you so angry at me?" "Because you have everything," Linda shouted. "Mom loves you, Dad loved you. No one even notices I exist." Grace sat quietly, her calm demeanor only fueling Linda's fury. "I never asked for this, Linda," Grace finally replied, her voice soft but firm. "I've only ever tried to do my best. If that bothers you, then I'm sorry, but it's not my fault." The words stung, but Linda didn't respond. Instead, she turned away, her mind racing with thoughts of how unfair it all seemed. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, vowing that one day she would make everyone see her. In the days that followed, the tension between the sisters only grew. Grace continued to excel, oblivious to the storm brewing within Linda. Martha, in her grief-stricken state, remained blind to the growing divide between her daughters, unknowingly fanning the flames of Linda's resentment with her favoritism. And so the seeds of rivalry were planted, setting the stage for a conflict that would shape their lives forever. The atmosphere in the Makori household grew increasingly tense as the years went by. The rivalry between Grace and Linda became an unspoken undercurrent that defined their relationship. Though outwardly polite, their interactions were laden with suppressed emotions. Grace often tried to maintain the peace, but her attempts were either misunderstood by Linda or dismissed entirely. Grace's accomplishments continued to pile up. By the time she turned 18, she had won several academic competitions, received a scholarship to study law at a prestigious university in Nairobi's Upper Hill, and gained admiration from both family and community. Martha was relentless in praising Grace at every opportunity, telling anyone who would listen how proud she was. "Grace is such a blessing," Martha would often say. "She reminds me so much of her father, always disciplined, always focused." Linda, however, had a different path. Her fiery nature and impulsive decisions often led her into trouble. She struggled in school, barely passing her exams, and Martha's constant criticism only made matters worse. On one occasion, after Linda came home with poor results, Martha berated her in front of Grace. "Do you even care about your future?" Martha scolded, holding the report card like evidence of a crime. "Look at Grace, she's younger than you, yet she carries herself with so much responsibility. You should learn from her." Grace, sitting quietly nearby, shifted uncomfortably. She hated being the cause of Linda's humiliation, but she didn't know how to intervene without making things worse. Linda's face burned with anger and shame. That night, in their shared bedroom, Linda lashed out. "You just sit there like a saint while Mom tears me apart," she shouted, her voice trembling. "Why don't you ever defend me?" Grace looked up, startled. "I didn't ask her to say those things, Linda." "It's not my fault." "Of course it's not your fault," Linda spat sarcastically. "Nothing ever is it?" Their once warm relationship had now become brittle, with cracks widening by the day. Grace tried to mend things by offering small gestures, helping Linda with her schoolwork, sharing advice, and even covering for her when she made mistakes. But Linda saw these efforts as condescending. To her, Grace's kindness only reinforced her belief that she was inferior. As the sisters grew older, their lives diverged further. Grace secured her place at the university, moving out of the family home with Martha's glowing blessings and an emotional farewell. Linda, who had failed to gain admission to a university, was left behind, taking up odd jobs to stay busy. With Grace gone, the household became quieter, but the silence was heavy with unresolved emotions. Martha tried to push Linda to improve her life, but her words always carried a sharp edge of comparison. "If you had just focused like Grace, you wouldn't be wasting your potential," Martha would say, shaking her head in disappointment. Linda, feeling abandoned and judged, began withdrawing from her mother entirely. She spent more time with her friends, seeking validation and distractions outside the home. Grace, meanwhile, thrived in her studies and sent home glowing updates about her achievements. Each letter or phone call from Grace felt like another nail in the coffin of Linda's self-worth. One weekend, Grace returned home for a visit. She had just won a mock trial competition and wanted to share the good news with her family. Martha, as expected, was ecstatic, preparing a feast to celebrate Grace's success. As neighbors and relatives gathered to congratulate her, Linda lingered in the background, simmering with jealousy. Later that evening, after everyone had left, Linda confronted her mother. "Do you even see me anymore?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Martha looked at her, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Of course I see you." "No, you don't," Linda said bitterly. "You see Grace. You've always seen Grace. I'm just here in the shadows." Martha sighed, her patience wearing thin. "Linda, you're the one standing in your own shadow. Grace works hard and that's why she succeeds. If you put in half the effort she does, you'd be just as successful." The words felt like a slap. Linda stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. In that moment, her resentment solidified into something darker. She wasn't just jealous of Grace, she began to hate her for the life she believed she would never have. Back in her room, Linda stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. For years, she had tried to compete with Grace, to earn her mother's approval and to feel seen. Now she decided she would stop trying to compete the right way. If she couldn't win the admiration she craved, she would take away the source of her pain, Grace's success. As Grace prepared to return to university the next day, she noticed Linda's cold demeanor but didn't press the issue. She assumed Linda just needed time and space to figure things out. What she didn't know was that Linda's bitterness had reached a dangerous tipping point. The Makori household, once a place of love and laughter, was now divided, a battlefield where one sister's light cast the other in shadow. And while Grace remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing, Linda was already making plans to tear her sister's world apart. Grace returned to university in Nairobi with a light heart, unaware of the storm brewing back home. Her life was on an upward trajectory. She was excelling in her law program, making new friends, and had recently caught the attention of a fellow student, Mark, whose quiet charm and unwavering ambition mirrored her own. Back in Westlands, Linda felt the full weight of Grace's absence. The house was quieter without her sister's constant presence, but it wasn't a comforting silence. Martha, now focused solely on Linda, shifted her attention to pushing her younger daughter to improve herself. Yet every suggestion, every lecture, every comparison to Grace only deepened the chasm between them. "You could take some extra classes," Martha said one evening as they cleared the table. "It's not too late to turn your life around." "Turn my life around?" Linda snapped, her voice bitter. "What do you mean, Mom? That I'm a failure because I'm not Grace?" "That's not what I'm saying," Martha replied wearily. "But you can't keep living like this, hopping from job to job with no direction. Look at Grace, she's building her future." Linda threw the dish rag onto the counter. "Of course, it always comes back to Grace." Her nights were restless, spent thinking of all the ways she could escape Grace's shadow. Her jobs as a cashier and later as a receptionist felt meaningless compared to Grace's glowing accomplishments. Her friends, noticing her bitterness, tried to cheer her up with nights out in downtown Nairobi, but even those distractions felt hollow. She began to resent not just Grace, but everyone who seemed to thrive while she struggled. Meanwhile, Grace's life flourished. She and Mark grew closer, their shared passion for success forging a strong bond. On weekends, he introduced her to parts of Nairobi she had never explored before, the bustling markets of Gikomba, the serene cafes in Karen, and the lush gardens of Nairobi Arboretum. Their relationship was effortless, and for the first time in a long time, Grace felt she had found someone who truly understood her. Grace often called home to check on her mother and sister, but the conversations were always strained. Martha would speak enthusiastically about Grace's latest achievements, only to sigh in frustration when asked about Linda. Linda, on the other hand, avoided the phone entirely, making excuses whenever Grace tried to reach her directly. The divide between the sisters widened even further when Grace returned home for a brief holiday. She had just won a coveted internship at a top law firm in Nairobi, and Martha couldn't contain her excitement. "My Grace is unstoppable," Martha exclaimed as they prepared dinner. "Mark my words, she's going to be one of the best lawyers in Kenya." Linda, standing in the corner of the kitchen, slammed the cabinet shut. "Maybe you should adopt her," she muttered under her breath. The comment hung in the air, but Martha ignored it, choosing instead to heap more praise on Grace. Later that evening during dinner, Martha brought up Grace's internship again, prompting neighbors and relatives to offer their congratulations. Linda sat silently, her fists clenched under the table. After the guests left, Linda confronted her mother in the living room. "Do you even realize what you're doing?" she demanded. "Every time you praise Grace, you remind me that I'll never be good enough for you." Martha, taken aback, frowned. "Linda, that's not true. I love you both equally." "Then why don't you act like it?" Linda shouted, her voice breaking. "Why don't you ever celebrate me the way you celebrate her?" Grace, overhearing the argument from the hallway, stepped in. "Linda, this isn't a competition," she said softly. "You don't have to prove yourself to anyone." "Easy for you to say," Linda snapped. "You've already won." The tension simmered through the remainder of Grace's visit. When she returned to Nairobi, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. She shared her concerns with Mark, who encouraged her to focus on her studies and let Linda work through her issues. "She'll come around," he said reassuringly. "Sometimes people just need time." But Linda didn't need time, she needed validation. Her resentment, now fully entrenched, began to drive her down a darker path. She started avoiding home altogether, spending her days with friends who encouraged her bitterness. One evening, as they sat drinking at a small bar in downtown Nairobi, one of her friends suggested something that stuck in her mind. "Why don't you stop waiting for them to notice you?" the friend said. "If they won't give you what you deserve, take it." Linda's lips curved into a small, bitter smile. Maybe her friend was right. If no one would see her for who she was, then she would make sure they noticed her, no matter what it took. The sisters' paths had diverged completely. While Grace's light continued to shine brightly in Nairobi's upper hill, Linda's world grew darker in the streets of downtown Nairobi. And though they were miles apart, the invisible thread of their rivalry was tightening, pulling them toward an inevitable collision. Grace's life in Nairobi continued to flourish. Her internship at one of the top law firms in Upper Hill was everything she had dreamed of. She quickly became a favorite among the senior partners who admired her intelligence and work ethic. Her relationship with Mark blossomed alongside her career, and the couple became inseparable, often spending weekends exploring the city or attending events in Karen and Westlands. Mark, ever the gentleman, supported Grace in every way. He often reminded her of her worth, especially during moments of self-doubt. "You're amazing, Grace," he told her one evening as they strolled through Karura Forest. "One day you'll be the kind of lawyer everyone talks about." For Grace, life felt almost too perfect. But in the back of her mind, there was a nagging worry about Linda. Her younger sister's absence from family gatherings and curt responses to phone calls had become more noticeable. Grace often asked her mother about Linda, but Martha would wave off her concerns. "Linda is just going through a phase," Martha said dismissively. "She'll come around when she's ready." But Linda wasn't ready. Back in Westlands, she felt suffocated by her mother's constant nagging and the shadow of her sister's success. Her odd jobs brought her little satisfaction, and the small group of friends she surrounded herself with only fueled her resentment. They encouraged her bitterness, often mocking Grace's perfect life and telling Linda that she deserved better. One day, Martha invited both daughters to a family dinner to celebrate Grace's recent promotion at her law firm. Linda reluctantly agreed to attend, dreading the inevitable comparisons and the endless praise heaped upon her sister. The dinner was held at their family home, and as expected, it quickly turned into a celebration of Grace's achievements. Neighbors and relatives gathered around the table, sharing stories of Grace's brilliance and her bright future. Linda sat silently, her hands clenched under the table, the bitterness rising in her chest like bile. Martha, oblivious to Linda's discomfort, raised her glass in a toast. "To Grace, the pride of our family," she declared, her voice filled with pride. Linda could feel the eyes of the guests shifting toward her, their pitying glances burning into her skin. Her face flushed with anger as the room erupted in applause. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Enough!" she shouted, silencing the room. "Do you people ever stop? Grace this, Grace that? Is that all this family is about?" The guests stared in stunned silence as Linda's voice trembled with rage. "You act like Grace is the only one who matters, but have you ever stopped to think how that makes me feel?" "I'm your daughter too, Mom," Martha, taken aback, frowned. "Linda, this isn't the time." "Of course it's not the time," Linda interrupted. "It's never the time, is it? Because no one cares about what I think or feel." Tears streaming down her face, Linda stormed out of the house, leaving the guests in an awkward silence. Grace followed her outside, her heart aching at the sight of her sister's pain. "Linda, wait," she called, catching up to her. "Please, let's talk." Linda whirled around, her face contorted with anger. "Talk about what, Grace? How perfect you are. How everyone adores you while I'm nothing but a failure." "You're not a failure," Grace said softly. "You're my sister and I love you." "Don't patronize me," Linda spat. "You'll never understand what it's like to be me. To always be second place, to never be enough." Grace reached out to touch Linda's arm, but Linda pulled away and disappeared into the night. Back inside, Martha tried to explain Linda's outburst to the guests, but the damage had already been done. Grace returned to the table, her appetite gone, and the rest of the evening was a blur. The incident left Grace deeply unsettled. She confided in Mark the next day, telling him about Linda's outburst. "I feel like I'm losing her," Grace admitted. "I don't know how to fix this." Mark held her hand. "It's not your fault, Grace. You've done everything you can. Sometimes people have to find their own way." But Linda's way was leading her down a dangerous path. The anger that had consumed her during the dinner didn't fade, it grew stronger. She began to believe that Grace was not just her rival but the source of all her unhappiness. And if Grace's life was so perfect, then maybe it was time to tear it apart. Linda's anger simmered long after the disastrous family dinner. Each time she replayed the events in her mind, her frustration grew sharper, her envy deeper. She saw Grace's calm demeanor and perfect life not as something to admire, but as a taunting reminder of her own failures. Back in Westlands, Linda's interactions with her mother became more strained. Martha, frustrated by Linda's refusal to make something of herself, nagged her relentlessly. Grace was born in the same house, under the same conditions, yet look at her, Martha said one afternoon as Linda sat scrolling through her phone. You could learn so much from her. Linda snapped her head up, her voice rising. Maybe if you treated me like a person instead of a disappointment, I'd be able to achieve something. Martha shook her head, muttering under her breath, You're your own problem, Linda. Those words lingered in Linda's mind, cutting deeper each time she thought about them. She began spending more time with her friends, mostly a group of discontented young people who indulged in wild nights at clubs in downtown Nairobi, far removed from Grace's polished and respectable world. Among them was Vera, who had a knack for fanning Linda's bitterness. Why do you even let your family treat you like that? Vera asked one evening as they sat at a bar in Kilimani, sipping cheap cocktails. What can I do about it? Linda replied bitterly. Easy, Vera said with a sly grin. Stop playing by their rules. If Grace has everything, take something from her. At first, Linda brushed off Vera's suggestion, but the idea took root. Why should Grace get everything? Her perfect career, her perfect relationship, their mother's undivided love, none of it seemed fair. If no one in her family was going to notice her, maybe it was time to force them to. Meanwhile, Grace remained unaware of Linda's growing hostility. Her days were consumed by work at the law firm and her evenings spent with Mark, who was planning to propose. He had already bought a ring and had confided in Grace's closest friend, Catherine, about his plan to surprise her. She's going to love it, Catherine said during a coffee date at a chic cafe in Karen. Grace deserves all the happiness in the world. But Linda's world was far from happy. One evening, as she sat alone in her small apartment, the bitterness overwhelmed her. She began plotting small ways to undermine Grace, thinking of how to make her sister feel the sting of failure. Her first move was to spread rumors. She began telling people in their community that Grace's success wasn't entirely honest. You know how she's always so perfect? Maybe it's because she has people helping her behind the scenes, Linda told one neighbor. No one can be that flawless on their own. The rumors were subtle at first, but they spread like wildfire. Soon Martha began hearing whispers at the market, though she dismissed them as jealousy from outsiders. Grace, too focused on her work and relationship, remained oblivious. Linda's next move was more calculated. She learned through a family friend that Grace was working on a high-stakes case for her law firm. Using her connections, Linda obtained confidential documents related to the case and leaked them anonymously to the opposing party. The leak caused chaos at Grace's firm, jeopardizing her reputation and nearly losing her the case. Though the firm managed to recover, the incident left Grace shaken. I can't believe this happened, Grace confided to Mark one evening. Someone deliberately tried to sabotage me. Mark frowned, his protective instincts kicking in. You've made a lot of enemies by being so good at what you do. But don't worry, we'll figure out who's behind this. But Linda wasn't finished. Her next target was Mark. Through her network of friends, she spread false rumors about Grace being unfaithful, claiming she had been seen with another man at a cafe. Mark, though trusting of Grace, couldn't ignore the whispers entirely. Have you been meeting someone? He asked her one evening, his tone uncertain. Grace looked at him shocked. What? Of course not. Where is this coming from? Though Mark believed her, the seeds of doubt had been planted, and Linda was satisfied with the cracks she had begun to create in her sister's seemingly perfect life. But as Linda's schemes grew bolder, so did her recklessness. She began to lose control and her bitterness started to consume her. One night, after another argument with Martha, Linda sat in her apartment, staring at a bottle of wine. An idea came to her, one that would escalate her actions to a dangerous new level. If Grace wants to be the golden child forever, she thought bitterly, then let's see how she shines when her world falls apart. Unbeknownst to Grace, her sister's resentment had crossed a line and the storm was about to break. Linda's anger had morphed into an obsession. Her bitterness consumed her, leaving her no room for joy or regret. She began plotting her most dangerous move yet, an act she believed would bring Grace to her knees. The opportunity came during another family dinner, one Martha insisted on hosting to celebrate Grace's engagement to Mark. The news of Grace's upcoming wedding had spread quickly, igniting a flurry of excitement among family and friends. Linda, however, felt nothing but rage. While others gushed over the diamond ring on Grace's finger, Linda clenched her fists beneath the table, her face frozen in a bitter smile. The dinner, held at their home in Westlands, was bustling with relatives and neighbors. Martha had spared no expense, preparing a feast fit for royalty and decorating the house with flowers and lights. Linda arrived late, dressed in a simple outfit that contrasted sharply with Grace's elegant attire. As soon as she walked in, she felt the familiar sting of being overshadowed by her sister. Martha was beaming as she introduced Grace and Mark to the guests. "This is what happens when you work hard and stay focused," she said, her voice carrying across the room. Grace has always been a shining example of what it means to be a good daughter. Linda's jaw tightened as she reached for a glass of wine, her hand trembling with suppressed anger. The rest of the evening was a blur of conversations and laughter, with Grace at the center of it all. Linda stayed in the background, silently observing, her mind racing with plans. At one point, Martha approached Linda and said, "Why don't you try to be happy for your sister?" "This is her moment." Linda's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "Of course, Mom, it's always her moment." Later that night, Linda quietly slipped into the kitchen, where she had stashed a small vial of poison she'd purchased weeks earlier. She poured the substance into a glass of wine, her hands shaking as she worked. She told herself it was justified that Grace needed to be taken down a notch. She carried the glass back to the dining room, scanning the room for her sister. Grace was sitting beside Mark, laughing at something he'd said. Linda hesitated for a moment, the weight of her actions catching up to her. But then she saw Martha approaching Grace, her face glowing with pride, and her resolve hardened. As Linda made her way toward Grace, Martha intercepted her, taking the glass of wine from her hands. "Oh, Linda, you finally brought something to the table," Martha joked, raising the glass for a toast. Before Linda could react, Martha took a sip. The moment felt like slow motion. Linda watched in horror as Martha's face contorted in pain, the glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the floor. The room erupted into chaos as Martha collapsed, clutching her chest. "Call an ambulance," Grace screamed, rushing to her mother's side. Mark and a few other guests helped lay Martha on the floor as someone frantically dialed for help. Linda stood frozen, her heart pounding as she watched the scene unfold. She hadn't meant for this to happen. Martha wasn't supposed to be the one to suffer. The ambulance arrived minutes later, though it felt like hours. As paramedics carried Martha out on a stretcher, Grace turned to Linda, her face pale with fear and confusion. "What happened, Linda? Why didn't you stop her from drinking that wine?" Linda stammered, her mind racing for an excuse. I didn't know. I didn't think." But Grace was already turning away, too focused on her mother to notice Linda's trembling hands. At the hospital, the doctors managed to stabilize Martha, though she remained unconscious. Grace stayed by her mother's bedside, holding her hand and praying silently. Mark sat beside her, offering quiet support, while relatives filled the waiting room, murmuring in hushed tones about what could have caused Martha's collapse. Linda, unable to face her family, left the hospital and returned to her apartment. She sat in the dark, replaying the night's events in her mind. The guilt was unbearable, but she couldn't bring herself to admit what she had done. Instead, she convinced herself it had been an accident, an unfortunate consequence of her plans. Back at the hospital, Grace was struggling to make sense of what had happened. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to the incident than met the eye. She remembered the way Linda had looked at her during the dinner, the bitterness in her eyes, the tension in her voice. A small nagging thought began to form in Grace's mind, but she pushed it aside. Linda wouldn't hurt Mom, she told herself. She's upset, but she's not capable of that. But deep down, Grace wasn't so sure. The Makori household was thrown into chaos after Martha's collapse. Though she had survived, she remained unconscious in the hospital's intensive care unit. Grace spent most of her time at her mother's bedside, praying for her recovery. The vibrant, commanding woman who had once held their family together now lay silent, her condition a haunting reminder of how fragile life could be. For Linda, the weight of her guilt became unbearable. She avoided the hospital entirely, unable to face her family or even herself. In her small apartment, she sat in the dark, her mind racing. The plan had gone horribly wrong. Martha wasn't supposed to be the one to suffer, but the unintended consequences of her actions had left Linda spiraling. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself over and over, tears streaming down her face. But even as guilt gnawed at her, a part of her clung to the bitterness that had driven her to act in the first place. In her mind, Grace was still to blame. Grace had everything: their mother's love, a promising career, and a fiancé who adored her. Meanwhile, Linda was drowning in obscurity, her life reduced to a series of failures. At the hospital, Grace struggled with her own suspicions. Though she tried to believe the best in her sister, the events of the dinner lingered in her mind. Why had Linda looked so uncomfortable that night? Why had she avoided the hospital since their mother was admitted? The questions gnawed at her, but she couldn't bring herself to confront Linda, not yet. Mark, ever the supportive partner, noticed Grace's growing unease. "You've been quiet," he said one evening as they sat together in the hospital waiting room. "Is something bothering you?" Grace hesitated before speaking. "It's Linda. I can't shake the feeling that she knows more about what happened to Mom than she's letting on." Mark frowned, leaning closer. "Do you think she had something to do with it?" Grace sighed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to believe it, but something feels off." Mark nodded, his expression serious. "Then we need to find out the truth." Meanwhile, Linda's bitterness continued to fester. She convinced herself that she had nothing to lose and began crafting a new plan, one final act to bring Grace down. This time, she would target the one thing Grace loved most, Mark. Using her network of friends, Linda spread more rumors about Grace's supposed infidelity, planting seeds of doubt in Mark's mind. She went as far as staging a scene, hiring a man to approach Grace at a cafe and act overly familiar with her while Mark happened to be passing by. Though Mark trusted Grace, the constant whispers began to wear on him. One evening, he confronted her. "I know this is ridiculous, but people keep saying things," he said, his tone uncertain. "Are you sure there's nothing I should know?" Grace looked at him, hurt flashing across her face. "Mark, I've never lied to you. Why would you even ask me that?" Mark immediately regretted his words. "I'm sorry, Grace. I didn't mean to doubt you. It's just these rumors won't stop." Grace's hands trembled as she reached for his. "It's Linda," she said, her voice firm. "I don't have proof, but I know she's behind this." "She's trying to tear us apart?" Mark nodded solemnly. "If that's true, we can't let her win. But we need to confront her, Grace. This can't go on." The confrontation came sooner than expected. A few days later, Linda finally showed up at the hospital, looking pale and frazzled. Grace, who was sitting by Martha's bedside, stood as her sister entered the room. "It's about time you showed up," Grace said, her voice cold. Linda avoided her gaze. "I've been busy," she muttered. Grace's patience snapped. "Busy doing what?" "Spreading lies about me, sabotaging my life. Do you even care about what you've done to Mom?" Linda froze, her face flushing with anger. "Don't you dare put this on me, Grace. You've always been the perfect one, the one who could do no wrong. Maybe if Mom hadn't spent her entire life worshipping you, I wouldn't be in this mess." "This isn't about Mom's favoritism anymore, Linda," Grace shouted. "This is about you. You've let your jealousy ruin everything, and now look at what's happened. Mom is lying here because of you." Linda's eyes widened, her defenses crumbling under the weight of her sister's accusations. For a moment, it looked like she might confess, but then she turned and fled the room. As Grace watched her sister leave, she felt a mixture of anger and sadness. She wanted to hate Linda for everything she had done, but deep down, she still loved her. Grace turned to Mark, who had witnessed the confrontation. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We protect ourselves, Grace, and we keep moving forward." But Grace knew it wouldn't be that simple. Linda's actions had already caused so much pain, and it was clear she wasn't finished yet. The storm between them was far from over, and Grace could only hope they could all survive what was coming next. The tension between the sisters reached its breaking point. Linda's guilt weighed heavily on her, but her bitterness continued to justify her actions. Despite Grace's confrontation at the hospital, Linda refused to take responsibility for her role in their mother's collapse. Instead, she convinced herself that she was the victim, the one overlooked and mistreated. Grace, however, had had enough. She couldn't ignore the pattern of Linda's behavior any longer. The sabotage at her firm, the false rumors about her fidelity, and now their mother's poisoning, everything pointed to Linda. Grace was determined to uncover the truth not just for herself but for her family. One evening, as Mark sat beside her in their apartment, Grace voiced her decision. "I need answers, Mark. Linda's been out of control for too long. If I don't confront her properly, this will never stop." Mark nodded, his voice steady. "I'll support you, whatever you decide. But be careful, Grace. She's unpredictable." The confrontation took place at Linda's apartment. Grace arrived unannounced, her heart pounding as she knocked on the door. It took a moment, but Linda eventually opened it, her face pale and drawn. "What do you want?" Linda asked, her tone defensive. "The truth," Grace said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Linda crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. "I don't know what you're talking about." Grace took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Mom almost died, Linda. You've been spreading lies about me, sabotaging my career, and now this? I deserve to know why." Linda's composure cracked, her voice rising. "Why? You want to know why? Because I'm tired of being nothing. Tired of being the shadow to your perfect life. Do you even know what it's like to be me? To always be compared to you and told I'm not good enough?" Grace stared at her sister, a mix of sadness and disbelief on her face. "Linda, I never asked for any of this. I've worked hard for everything I have, but that doesn't mean I ever wanted you to feel this way." Linda's eyes filled with tears, but her anger didn't falter. "You don't get it, Grace. You've always been the star, the one everyone loves. I'm just a failure they tolerate." Grace stepped closer, her voice softening. "You're not a failure, Linda. You're my sister, and I love you. But what you've done, it's not right. You could have talked to me. We could have worked through this together." Linda shook her head, her voice breaking. "It's too late for that. You don't understand how far I've gone." Grace's heart sank. "Then make it right, Linda. Tell me the truth about what happened to Mom." Linda looked away, the weight of her guilt crushing her. After a long silence, she finally whispered, "It was me. I didn't mean for her to drink it, Grace. The poison was meant for you." Grace froze, the words hitting her like a blow. For a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't move. The sister she had grown up with, the person she had loved and forgiven time and again had tried to kill her. "You were going to poison me?" Grace finally said, her voice trembling. Linda sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I wasn't thinking, I wanted to hurt you the way I've been hurting. But it went wrong, and now I've ruined everything." Grace stared at her sister, a wave of emotions crashing over her: anger, sadness, betrayal. But above all, she felt an overwhelming sense of loss. The bond they had once shared, however fractured, now seemed irreparably broken. "You need help, Linda," Grace said quietly. "This can't go on. You have to take responsibility for what you've done." Linda looked up, tears streaming down her face. "What are you going to do? Tell Mom?" "The police?" Grace hesitated, the weight the decision pressing down on her. "I don't know yet, but I can't keep this a secret, Linda. You've crossed too many lines." Later that night, Grace confided in Mark about Linda's confession. He listened quietly, his jaw tightening as she recounted the details. "You can't let this slide, Grace," he said firmly. What she did was dangerous. Next time it could be worse. Grace nodded, her eyes filled with tears. I know, but she's still my sister. I don't want to destroy her. She's destroying herself, Mark replied gently, and she's hurting everyone around her in the process. Sometimes the best way to help someone is to hold them accountable. Grace knew he was right, but the thought of exposing Linda's actions was almost too much to bear. For now, all she could do was pray that her sister would take the first step toward redemption on her own. At the hospital, Martha began to show signs of improvement, her strength slowly returning. When she opened her eyes for the first time in days, Grace was at her side, holding her hand. "Mom," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Martha smiled weakly, her eyes filling with tears. "You're here," she said softly. "Where's Linda?" Grace hesitated, unsure how to answer. But before she could speak, Martha's expression changed, a flicker of realization crossing her face. "Grace, what happened that night? What aren't you telling me?" Grace squeezed her mother's hand, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth. The reckoning wasn't over yet, and the hardest decisions were still to come. Martha's recovery brought a sliver of hope to the family, but the tension lingered like a shadow. Grace couldn't bring herself to tell her mother the full truth about Linda's actions, but she knew the time for honesty was approaching. Linda, meanwhile, had retreated into isolation, struggling with guilt and fear. One afternoon, Grace found herself sitting beside Martha's hospital bed, their hands intertwined. Martha's voice was weak but steady as she asked again, "What really happened that night, Grace?" Grace hesitated, the words caught in her throat. Finally, she said, "Mom, it was an accident, but Linda made a mistake. She didn't mean for you to get hurt." Martha's brow furrowed as she tried to process Grace's words. "What kind of mistake?" Grace's eyes filled with tears. "She was trying to hurt me, Mom. She was angry and she wasn't thinking clearly." The weight of the revelation settled over them like a heavy cloud. Martha closed her eyes, her face a mix of sorrow and disappointment. "I always knew Linda was struggling," she whispered, "but I never thought it would come to this." Grace squeezed her mother's hand. "She's not beyond help, Mom. She's been hurting for a long time, and we need to find a way to fix this together." That evening, Grace made the difficult decision to visit Linda again. She found her sister in the same state as before, sitting on the couch in her dimly lit apartment, her face pale and drawn. "Linda," Grace began softly, stepping inside. "Mom's awake." Linda's head shot up, panic flashing across her face. "What did you tell her?" "The truth," Grace replied. "She knows what happened, but she also knows you didn't mean to hurt her. She's willing to forgive you, Linda, but only if you're willing to take responsibility." Linda's shoulders slumped, her eyes filling with tears. "I don't know if I can face her, Grace. I've messed everything up. She'll never look at me the same way again." Grace sat beside her, placing a hand on her sister's knee. "You're right. Things won't go back to the way they were overnight. But you can start by apologizing and trying to make things right. Mom loves you, Linda. We both do." Linda looked at her sister, her expression a mixture of guilt and hope. "How can you still love me after everything I've done to you?" "Because you're my sister," Grace said simply. "And despite everything, I still believe in you." The next day, Linda accompanied Grace to the hospital. She walked in with her head bowed, her hands trembling as she approached their mother's bedside. Martha looked up, her eyes softening as she saw her younger daughter. "Mom," Linda whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was angry, but I never wanted to hurt you." Martha reached out, taking Linda's hands in her own. "Linda, I've made mistakes too," she said gently. "I should have been more understanding, more supportive. I've always loved you, but I didn't show it the way I should have." Linda broke down, sobbing into her mother's arms. For the first time in years, the walls between them began to crumble. In the weeks that followed, the family worked to rebuild their fractured relationships. Linda started attending therapy to address her jealousy and self-esteem issues, a step that Grace and Martha supported wholeheartedly. Though the scars of their past would take time to heal, there was a renewed sense of hope that things could get better. One afternoon, the sisters sat together on the porch of their family home in Westlands, sipping tea and watching the sunset. It was the first time in years they had shared a moment of peace. "I never thought we'd get here," Linda said quietly, glancing at Grace. Grace smiled, her eyes warm. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." Linda nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you for not giving up on me, Grace. I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." "You've always deserved it, Linda," Grace replied. "You just needed to see it for yourself." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows that had loomed over their family began to lift, replaced by the soft glow of a new beginning. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.